It was October, and my girlfriend was looking forward to her time off. She'd spent the past few months in the rush of college life at NYU, and after weeks of endless classes and city noise, she craved the quiet that only a trip back home could bring. She grew up in Buffalo, New York, a place that always felt familiar, even when she was far from it. So, when she found out she had a few free days, she called up a few friends from high school and decided to take a trip to a nearby campsite, something to help her unwind. The plan was simple: glamping in the woods with a cabin, a campfire, and a break from the city. Little did she know, this trip would become a night she'd never forget. Her friends, 4 of them, were all either 19 or 20, the kind of friends she'd known for years. They were eager to catch up, and the idea of camping in a cozy cabin, enjoying the fall air and the warmth of a fire, seemed like the perfect escape. They packed up, made the drive out to the site, and once they got there, the setting was everything she imagined. Rustic cabins scattered around, picnic tables and fire rings. The area was secluded, offering a quiet that made it feel as though the world was miles away. It was everything they had hoped for. As they unloaded their gear, my girlfriend and her friends noticed they weren't alone. A group of 4 guys, around the same age as them, had set up camp in the neighboring cabin. The guys were friendly enough, and after a brief conversation, one of them asked if they wanted to join them for a beer around sunset. No harm in that, my girlfriend thought. She wasn't much of a drinker, but a few beers by the fire seemed harmless enough. When the sun began to dip below the tree-line, they met up at one of the picnic tables. The fire crackled between them as the beers flowed. Everyone was laughing, chatting, and enjoying the evening. The night felt normal, relaxed, fun. The conversations shifted from lighthearted banter to more personal topics, and everyone was getting to know each other. It was exactly the kind of getaway she needed. But as the night wore on, things started to take a turn. One of the guys, a bit more drunk than the others, excused himself and wandered back into his cabin. He returned moments later holding a revolver. He waved it around carelessly, boasting about how it was his dad's gun. My girlfriend and her friends exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of it. He was obviously drunk, and it didn't take long for the mood to shift. "Put that away, man," one of the girls said, her voice laced with concern. "You're way too drunk to be messing around with that." The guy laughed it off. "It's fine. It's not even loaded," he slurred, clearly enjoying the attention. But even if it wasn't loaded, the fact that he was waving a gun around like it was a toy made everyone uneasy. Still, the guy continued. "I'll prove it," he said, pointing the gun to the sky. He pulled the trigger 2 or 3 times, each time with a dry click. No shots. The group, relieved but still uncomfortable, told him to go put the gun away. He didn't listen. Instead, he started to get defensive, acting like everyone was overreacting. "I'm fine," he muttered. "It's just a stupid gun. It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. My girlfriend could feel the tension building. No one was enjoying themselves anymore. Her gut told her this was a bad situation, but the guy with the gun didn't seem to care. He was getting more aggressive, slurring his words as he argued with the others. Then the situation escalated further. The guy, irritated and showing no sign of stopping, did something none of them could have predicted. He spun the revolver in his hand, making a show of it. "You think I'm a joke?" he sneered, holding the gun to his own head. My girlfriend froze. "No, don't," one of the other girls tried to say, but the guy didn't listen. He pulled the trigger. Nothing. He smiled, seemingly pleased with himself. "See? It's empty." But then, almost as though to prove a point, he pulled the trigger again. And this time, there was a deafening bang. For a second, everything went still. The sound of the shot echoed through the trees, and no one moved. Then, like a switch had been flipped, chaos erupted. The guy with the gun collapsed backward, a gaping wound in his head. The scene was so surreal it didn't register right away. My girlfriend felt her heart stop as she watched him fall, blood spilling from his skull, pooling around his lifeless body. Screams filled the air. My girlfriend could barely process what had just happened. Her body moved on its own as she dropped to her knees beside the guy. She grabbed his wrist, feeling for a pulse, but it was no use. The other girl with her was already screaming, her hands shaking as she tried to apply pressure to the wound, even though it was pointless. Everyone was in a state of shock, frozen, except for the girl who was crying hysterically. "Get the phone! Call 911!" someone screamed, but my girlfriend couldn't even remember who said it. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. It felt like hours before the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, though she later learned it was only 30 minutes. In the meantime, the mood of the group had shifted completely. One of the guys, the one who had been closest to the shooter, had gone completely silent, his face blank. He looked like he had been drained of everything, no longer reacting to anything. Another friend was still crying, her sobs so intense that it seemed like she couldn't stop. Every time she tried to calm herself, the image of the guy pulling the trigger, the look on his face as the shot went off, came flooding back. She couldn't escape it. When the police and emergency services arrived, the reality of what had happened started to sink in. The guy was dead. There was no saving him. The night had turned into a nightmare. The police took their statements, but even as they spoke, my girlfriend could tell that none of them really knew what to say. How do you explain this? How do you make sense of a moment like that? The aftermath was worse than she could have imagined. They stayed at the campsite until the next morning, but there was no more laughing, no more joking. Everyone was shell-shocked, struggling to process what they'd seen. The girl who had tried to help the most, the one who had been so frantic, never stopped crying. The other girls didn't speak much, the silence between them heavy with unspoken grief. The doctor later called what they were all experiencing acute stress disorder, a condition that felt like it was on the edge of PTSD. My girlfriend and two of the other girls managed to recover in the following days, though the memories never quite left. But for the girl who couldn't stop crying, the aftermath of that night haunted her for years. She had nightmares, flashbacks, and deep emotional scars. The doctors put her on medication, but even years later, she still said that night ruined her life. That incident, that single moment of reckless stupidity, affected all of them in different ways. My girlfriend said she would never forget the look on the guy's face when the bullet hit. She also said that night shaped her views on guns forever. She wasn't against the Second Amendment, but that evening made her realize how dangerous it was for something as deadly as a firearm to fall into the wrong hands. Guns in the right hands could protect people, but when they were in the hands of a drunk idiot, they turned into something horrifying. The trip, once something they had all been excited for, was ruined in an instant. There was no laughter around the campfire, no more carefree conversations. All that was left was the lingering image of the guy who thought it was a joke, until the joke went too far. It's been years since that night, and my girlfriend still carries the weight of what happened. The nightmares have faded, but the fear of guns, the trauma, will never go away. The damage done that night is something you can't fix with time. You just learn to live with it, even if it never truly heals. It all started innocently enough. I grew up in central London, a city where survival meant navigating the rush hour tube and avoiding tourist crowds at Leicester Square. Nature, to me, was the occasional walk in a park, a brief respite from the chaos of concrete and steel. But one day, I watched one of those celebrity survival shows, the kind where some soap star is dropped into the wild and expected to survive with just a few rudimentary tools. And something clicked inside me. Could I survive if I were suddenly in a disaster? Or would I be like one of those helpless city dwellers, lost in a world with no Pret a manger for miles? I talked to my mates about it, trying to get them on board. But when I mentioned that I was planning to camp properly, no shiny campsite with a pub nearby, they all thought I was mad. They didn't get the appeal. They pictured a tidy, well-maintained space with a bathroom block and a kettle. When I told them it would be in a remote forest, no mobile phone signal, and no one around for miles, they dropped out one by one. So it ended up just being me taking the plunge. I'd done some solo trips before, nothing too intense, but the thought of heading to Galloway Forest Park in Scotland sent a thrill of nervous excitement through me. It's one of the most remote wildernesses in the UK. a place where you could walk for days without running into another soul. I was drawn to that isolation, that true wilderness. What would it be like to be completely alone? I didn't know if I had what it took, but I was determined to find out. I arrived in Newton Stewart on a dreary September morning and spent the night at a small hostel, Glen Malloch Lodge, where I'd left my car. The owners, like everyone else, thought I was out of my mind. They warned me that if anything went wrong, there was no one for miles. The nearest help was a couple of days' hike away. But I wasn't going to be deterred. I had maps, survival skills, and, if I'm being honest, a fair amount of pride. This was going to be a test. I woke up the next day, packed my gear, and headed out into the vast wilderness. By the end of the second day, I was deep in the forest, several miles away from any sign of life. It was a strange feeling. There was no hum of civilization, no cars, no people. Just me and the wild. The further I walked, the more I felt the weight of being truly alone. But also, there was a sense of freedom, a taste of what it might be like if everything were stripped away. I could do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I could make camp wherever I chose, and no one could stop me. Felt liberating. By the time the sun began to set, I needed to find a place to camp. I spotted a ridge line on my map, and after a tough climb, I found a small patch of trees where I could shelter for the night. I set up my shelter, a simple tarp strung between two trees, and got to work building a fire and preparing some food. As the evening drew on, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The fire crackled, the cold of the night air settled in, and I had a warm cup of cocoa to sip before sleep. As the fire burned down to embers, I placed my mug carefully beside the flames, intending to keep the last of the cocoa warm. Then, I crawled into my sleeping bag, my exhaustion washing over me as I closed my eyes. The second night always feels different, deeper. You're no longer a newbie in the wild. Your mind starts to relax. I drifted off to sleep, not as tense as the first night. When I woke up, everything felt peaceful. The sky was still dark, the air crisp. I sat up, my body aching from the previous day's hike. The first thing I noticed was the absence of my mug, the one I had left by the fire. At first, I thought I had simply forgotten where I put it, but as I glanced around, I saw it. There it was, perched perfectly atop a log, far from where I had placed it. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't remember moving it. I couldn't remember checking it in the night. I got to my feet, my mind racing. Had I done it in my sleep? I approached the log cautiously. There, inside the mug, was something out of place. A piece of grass, expertly knotted in several places, like a delicate string of tiny, intricate loops. It wasn't something I had done. No, this was someone else's work. Someone had been here. Someone had moved my mug and left me this offering. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. At first, my mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, maybe the wind knocked it over and something dragged it. But the knots? No animal does that. No animal leaves an offering. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The calm I'd felt moments before was gone, replaced by a creeping fear. Someone had been here, watching me, while I slept. I grabbed my knife, a small folding Victorinox, my only defense. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the trees and the open hillside. But there was no movement, no sounds, just the rustling of the wind through the grass. Still, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. Why would someone do this? I thought. The possibilities swirled in my mind, and none of them were good. They could have come at me with anything. A rock, a stick, anything. And they could have done anything they wanted. The fact that they hadn't made me more scared than I could have imagined. I spent the next few hours, the longest of my life, half hiding, half waiting. I didn't know if the person was still around. I didn't know if I was being hunted or if I was just being paranoid. But what I did know was that I was no longer alone. And the wilderness I had sought had turned into something terrifying, something unpredictable. I left that camp later that morning, not looking back, not stopping to check if my mug was still on that log. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the deep, gnawing feeling that I wasn't the only one out there. And from that moment on, I never camped alone in a place like Galloway Forest again. It was almost 20 years ago, Halloween of 2005, when I went on a camping trip that turned out to be anything but what I expected. I was apprehensive about going at first. My ex-boyfriend invited me, and there were going to be 3 of his friends, which meant I'd be the only girl in a group of 4 guys. I wasn't sure how it was going to go, especially since I knew his friends from a few previous outings, but I had a feeling this would be awkward. I thought it would just be a bunch of guys sitting around the fire, drinking beer and grilling meat. Honestly, I wasn't sure I trusted my boyfriend's judgment when it came to picking a campsite either. But much to my surprise, he and his friends had picked a beautiful spot. I'm not exaggerating here. It was perfect. There was a waterfall down one of the trails, so we had fresh drinking and washing water. The site was right where several trails converged, which meant we could choose an easy, medium, or hard hike depending on how hungover we were the next day. The best part was that, since it was late October, we had the place to ourselves. The weather was crisp, the trees were all golden, and everything felt peaceful. It was actually really nice. The guys were respectful and gave me space when I needed it. No awkward comments, nothing weird. It was just easy. That first night we went hiking. The trails were empty, and the air was fresh. We hiked for hours, just enjoying the quiet beauty of the place. By the time we got back to camp, we were all tired but content. We made some grilled food, had a few drinks, and then we all retired to our tents to sleep. I remember climbing into my sleeping bag and telling my ex how grateful I was for this trip. He just laughed, all smug like he'd been right about everything. And in that moment, I could admit he was right. It had been perfect. But the next morning, that peacefulness shattered in a way I couldn't explain. We woke up to absolute chaos. Our campsite, which had been so neat and quiet the night before, was wrecked. The campfire my boyfriend and his friends had made was completely destroyed. Rocks, which we'd used to ring the fire pit and stop it from spreading, were scattered all over the place. My boyfriend's truck doors were wide open. The stereo was smashed into pieces against a tree, and the cooler was overturned, with raw meat scattered across the ground. We just sat there in disbelief, poking our heads out of the tent and staring at the mess. How had this happened? We'd all been sound asleep. Nobody heard anything. It felt wrong, like something was off, but we couldn't explain it. We got out of the tents and began trying to figure out what had happened. The more we talked, the more confused we became. My ex immediately accused me of not locking his truck the night before, which made me furious. I remembered locking it. I was sure of it. I had a vivid memory of locking the doors, and I had put his keys in the front pocket of his backpack, way on the other side of the tent, far from the flap. I swore I did everything right. I was getting frustrated, and as he marched over to grab the keys, I could feel my stomach sinking. But the keys weren't in the bag. My blood ran cold. I began stumbling over my words, trying to explain that I had locked the truck, but there was no way to prove it now. I found the keys near the open truck door on the ground. How could they have gotten there? I felt lightheaded, like everything was spinning. My ex just stood there, completely quiet. Then he said he wanted to leave. He didn't say much else, just apologized to his friends, and we threw whatever we could salvage into his truck. We didn't talk on the way home. I kept asking him what he thought happened, why he thought the truck had been opened, why the cooler had been dumped. He wouldn't answer. He just kept saying he didn't know, and it was starting to drive me crazy. Finally, we pulled into a diner parking lot, both of us on edge, and he started to speak. He said something that shook me to my core. He said he'd had a bad dream the night before. Not a nightmare, but enough to wake him up. The way he described it was unsettling. He said that in his dream, he woke up and saw someone standing over him, crouched at the edge of his sleeping bag, with one foot on either side of him. He said the person's face didn't look right, like it was made out of something wrong, like ski mask material, but it wasn't a mask. It was something else. He realized he was dreaming and tried to shake it off, but that face stayed with him, even when he woke up. I didn't know what to make of it. His dream was odd, sure, but it didn't explain what had happened at the campsite. I pressed him for more details, but he just went quiet. I thought he was being weird, and he apologized again, but it didn't help. Something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling me. When we got back home, I called him later that day, but he said he didn't want to talk about it anymore. He had met up with his friends, and they all decided it was best to just move on. It was the most frustrating conversation I'd ever had. They didn't even want to talk to the cops or the park rangers, even though someone had clearly gone through our stuff in the middle of the night. The truck had been opened, the stereo destroyed, the cooler emptied, and no one heard a thing? That's when I started to think something was seriously wrong. My ex was obsessed with his truck, and if it had been damaged or stolen, he would have been all over it. But he didn't want to file a police report. He just wanted to forget about it, and that made me feel like I was going crazy. I wondered if he had blacked out or if he was involved somehow, maybe even unknowingly. Maybe it was something he couldn't face, something he was hiding from all of us. But the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that he had something to do with it. He was scared to admit that he'd lost control of whatever happened that night. We broke up less than a year later, and honestly, that camping trip was a small part of why we ended things. It wasn't just the wrecked campsite or the weirdness of the whole experience. It was that feeling I got, like I was losing my mind, like I wasn't being told the truth, like I was being kept in the dark. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, and I think, deep down, he knew it too. As for what really happened that night, I don't know. I'll never know. But I think whatever it was, it scared him. And it scared me too. I've never gone camping with him again. In fact, after that trip, he never went camping again either. Funny how that works, isn't it? This is the scariest true story I know, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it haunts me to this day. It's been almost 6 years now, and the events that transpired still don't make sense. It started with a man, my best friend's father, who was as ordinary as they come. At least that's how it seemed to all of us. The weird part is, he wasn't someone you'd ever expect to end up in a place like Roof Lake, up in the Northwest Territories of Canada. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I wonder if he ever intended to be found again. He was one of those guys who didn't care for the outdoors. In fact, he hated it. The kind of guy who liked staying indoors, tinkering with gadgets, watching TV, and avoiding anything that involved physical activity. If he could avoid walking the dogs, he would. He'd always say, "They're your dogs, not mine." And he wasn't shy about it. But then something strange happened, and it happened fast. One day, he announced that he was going camping. Not just in the backyard, but up in the wilderness. And not just any wilderness, but the kind that makes even the most seasoned outdoorsman uneasy. Roof Lake, a place so remote and cold that even seasoned hikers would hesitate to go there in the dead of winter. No one could understand it. He bought all this camping gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, cooking utensils, the works, and started talking about hiking, canoeing, and spending weeks in the wild. The strangest part was that he wasn't going alone. He was taking the family's 2 dogs with him. 2 dogs he had barely acknowledged for years. No one understood it. My friend thought his dad was going through some midlife crisis, but what else could they do other than let him do whatever he thought was right? He had never shown interest in anything like this before. But now, out of nowhere, he was planning a camping trip to one of the most isolated places in Canada. He left in September and told everyone he'd be back within a few weeks. But those weeks turned into months. And then, after a few phone calls to the local authorities, it became clear that no one knew where he was. The last anyone heard, he was supposed to return in mid-October. But by the end of October, he hadn't made it back. No sign of him anywhere. The family thought maybe he'd just extended his trip. But weeks passed, and soon it became obvious that something wasn't right. The search started. My friend's family reported him missing, and the authorities sent out search and rescue teams to comb the area around Roof Lake. The police and rescue teams spent weeks searching, but they found nothing. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks in the snow, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. The family was left to wonder. Had he gone off the grid? Did he decide he didn't want to be found? That idea didn't sit well with anyone. least of all my friend. His dad wasn't like that. He didn't just disappear. But as the weeks dragged on, and the search turned up nothing, everyone began to wonder if he was even alive. It was months before anyone even came close to finding anything. By March, 5 months had passed. The police started suggesting that he might not have made it through the harsh winter conditions. It was a long shot, but they suggested that perhaps he had fallen into one of the icy rivers, or worse, that animals had gotten to him. A thought none of us could shake. But my friend's family refused to give up. They clung to hope, holding out for some sign that he was alive. And then, in early April, they got something. A pilot, flying over the area for unrelated reasons, spotted something strange. It looked like a man walking, accompanied by 2 dogs. The pilot reported what he saw, and the police moved quickly. They sent a team out to search the area near Roof Lake, but they found something else entirely. My friend's dad's campsite. The tents, cooking supplies, and even some of his gear were scattered around. It was a strange sight. Some of the supplies appeared as if they had been left behind in a hurry. But the most bizarre thing was the presence of boating wax. It was a material that my friend's dad had never used before, and no one knew of him having a canoe, let alone using it on this trip. It didn't make sense. My friend's dad didn't own a canoe, as far as anyone knew. In fact, the only time he'd ever been near water was when the family went to a lake for a day trip, and that was always a hassle. But now, there was evidence suggesting he had used one. It was hard to make sense of, and there were more questions than answers. If he had a canoe, where was it? Why had he left the campsite behind? The search teams expanded their efforts, but after a couple of days of combing through the area, they still couldn't find any trace of him. His gear was there, but not him. It didn't add up. The search continued across the surrounding areas, to places like Yellowknife, and even farther out to Prince George. The idea was that he might have gone to visit an old college friend, but no one ever found any evidence to back up that theory. No one could figure out where he had gone or why he hadn't returned home. Months turned into years, and still, no one knew anything. The family tried to hold on to hope, but the chances of him being found alive grew slimmer with each passing season. And the more time that passed, the more it seemed like he had vanished completely. There were no bodies, no remains, not even his canoe. If a bear had gotten to him, as some had suggested, surely they would have found something. But there was nothing. It was as if he'd disappeared into thin air. Eventually, the police and search teams gave up. There had been no progress in finding anything for years. They had combed through every inch of the area and had turned up nothing. No clothing, no personal effects, no evidence that my friend's dad had ever been there. He had just vanished. It was as if the wilderness had swallowed him whole. The idea that he was still out there, living some sort of wild, untamed life, was hard to believe. He wasn't a survivalist. He wasn't someone who had the skills to survive for years without being found. No one believes he's alive anymore. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept. We want to think that maybe, just maybe, he's out there somewhere, living the life he always said he never wanted. But the reality is, it's been 5 years. Not even a single trace of him has ever been found. No footprints in the snow, no sign of his canoe, no discarded clothing. Nothing. In the years since, there have been rumors, of course. Some people said that if a canoe was covered by fresh snow, it could be hidden for years. Others suggested that wild animals might have dragged him away and eaten whatever was left of him. But the more I think about it, the less it all adds up. How do you lose a man, his gear, and his canoe in the wilderness without leaving a single trace? How does someone just disappear like that? The fact that they've never found a single thing, no remnants of his tent, no gear, nothing, feels off. It doesn't feel real. So what happened? It's the kind of thing that makes you question everything. What if he didn't just get lost in the wild? What if he didn't get eaten by animals? What if he just didn't want to be found? What if he really did vanish on purpose? But then I come back to the same thought. This wasn't the kind of guy who just disappears. He wasn't an outdoorsman, he didn't have the survival skills, and he didn't have the desire to just walk away from his family. He was a homebody, a guy who barely tolerated being around his dogs. And yet, one day he was gone. I can't say for certain what happened to him, Maybe he got lost, maybe he fell into the water and drowned, maybe something far worse happened to him. But the truth is, we'll never know. The wilderness doesn't give answers. It just takes. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing of all is the silence that follows when you can't even find a trace of someone. My name is Sarah, and I'm from Spokane, Washington. Some people think it's stupid for a young woman like me to be heading out on a solo camping trip, especially in a state that's seen its share of grim headlines, with 30 confirmed serial killers in the region. But I'm not the kind of person to shy away from adventure. I'm not naive, though. I carry a gun, just a small M&P Shield 9mm. It's not much, but it makes me feel safer when I'm out there alone, knowing that I have that option for self-defense. I know it's not a perfect protection, but it's better than nothing. It was last October when I decided to head up to Snow Lake. The fall air was crisp, the trails weren't too difficult, and I was craving some peace and quiet to help unwind. I needed to get away from the city, disconnect, and just breathe. Snow Lake seemed like the perfect place, with stunning views and a somewhat well-known trail, but still remote enough that I wouldn't feel crowded. Now, I know Snow Lake is one of the more popular spots in the Snoqualmie Pass area, and I typically prefer less traveled trails. But for some reason, the thought of being surrounded by a few other hikers made me feel better, as if I could rely on someone in case something went wrong. Maybe that was just my mind playing tricks, trying to convince me I wasn't really alone. I hiked about 4 or 5 miles into the trail before I found a good spot to set up camp, far enough off the beaten path for some privacy, but still close enough to the trail in case anything went south. The terrain was beautiful, covered in the rich hues of fall, and I was looking forward to a calm night by the fire, a warm meal, and a peaceful sleep. I unpacked my tent, set up my little campfire, and made some food, taking my time to enjoy the quiet of the forest. After eating, I knew I was pretty worn out from the hike, so I decided to call it a night. I wasn't one for staying up late while camping alone. I've always believed in getting a good rest to avoid unnecessary risks. So by 9 p.m., I was ready to crawl into my sleeping bag. I didn't even bother reading or using my phone. I just wanted to rest. I rolled up my sweater and shoved it in my pack to make a makeshift pillow, and before I knew it, I was out cold. I remember thinking that it didn't take me long at all to fall asleep, almost like my body was desperate for rest after the long hike. The next thing I remember was a dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. In the dream, my sister and I were sitting in the back of my dad's car, and we were on some kind of road trip. I didn't know where we were headed, but my sister kept teasing me about a crush I had back in high school. I told her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. I kept asking my dad to tell her to quit, but he didn't say anything. The whole thing was irritating, but it felt oddly familiar, like something I'd experienced before. And then, suddenly, I heard a sound, a zipper being pulled. It was so loud, like someone was pulling the zipper of a tent, right next to me. I blinked and tried to look around, but the darkness of my tent was impenetrable. I couldn't see anything outside, but the sound of the zipper continued, drawing closer, as if someone was standing just outside my tent and unzipping it slowly. It hit me like a ton of bricks. My mind cleared in an instant, and I realized that I wasn't in the car with my sister anymore. I was in my tent, and that zipper sound was real. Someone was at my tent trying to unzip it. I could feel my heart racing as I lay there in complete silence, trying to process what was happening. Without thinking, I reached for the gun in my bag. My hands were shaking, my fingers cold and stiff with adrenaline. I could hear the zipper moving again, the slow sound dragging on and on. I could feel the fear creeping up, but I forced myself to focus. I had trained with that gun. I had put in countless hours at the range, learning how to handle it, how to use it under pressure. But none of that seemed to matter as I fumbled to pull it out of my pack. The zipper kept moving. I could hear it clearly now, almost as if it were echoing in my head. I was shaking, but I had to get the gun ready. I finally drew it out, the cold metal of the M&P feeling heavy in my hands. My breath was coming fast and shallow, but I forced myself to stay still. I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to give away that I was armed, but I couldn't stop my hands from trembling. The zipper kept moving, inch by inch, and I could hear the tension growing outside the tent. The person hadn't spoken. They hadn't made a sound aside from that zipper, and it felt like time had stopped. I was completely frozen in place, my gun aimed at the tent flap, waiting for the next move. Finally, I spoke, my voice sounding weak even though I tried to make it sound fierce. "If you don't want to die right here, you need to get away from my tent." There was silence. The zipper stopped. I could feel the weight of that silence pressing down on me. I was holding my breath, wondering if the person had heard me, wondering if they were backing away or just waiting for me to make a move. I told them again, more firmly this time, my voice trembling with the fear that I couldn't control. "I have a gun pointed at you. If you don't leave in the next 5 seconds, I'll shoot." I waited. The silence stretched on, every second feeling like an eternity. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands still tight around the gun. Then finally I heard movement. Someone stood up, their footsteps crunching softly in the leaves as they took a few steps back. The sound of their footsteps gradually picked up pace, and it hit me, they were running away. I could hear their footfalls getting lighter and lighter as they retreated into the woods. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, there was silence again. I couldn't tell if the person had run off or if they had stopped just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. Couldn't risk it. I stayed completely still, gun aimed at the zipper, not daring to move. Time dragged on. My thoughts were spinning. I had called 911 the moment I could, my fingers shaking as I dialed. I explained what had happened, told them that someone had been at my tent, unzipping it. The dispatcher said they would notify the sheriff's office, but that the closest forest rangers could get to me in 20 minutes on ATVs. He warned me not to be alarmed if I heard the sound of engines in the distance. He said it would be the cavalry coming to help, but those 20 minutes felt like the longest of my life. I lay there, listening intently, still unable to move. Every sound in the night felt magnified, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, the eerie quiet that seemed to envelope the forest around me. I kept thinking about the person outside my tent, wondering if they were still close by, waiting to make another move. When the rangers finally arrived, I could hear the sound of their engines roaring in the distance, breaking the silence that had hung over me for what felt like hours. I wanted to scream with relief, but I stayed quiet, trying to gather myself together. The rangers got to my camp quickly, and I told them what had happened. They checked around the area, making sure no one was lurking nearby, but they found evidence of someone having walked off into the woods. Whoever it was hadn't been close, but they had left a trail that led deeper into the forest. They offered to give me a ride back to my car, and I didn't hesitate to accept. I was shaken, still trying to process what had happened. It had been the first time anything like that had happened to me, and honestly, it left me with more questions than answers. I'd like to tell you that I handled it all perfectly, that I was some cold, tough woman who didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. But the truth is, I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared for what it felt like to truly face the possibility of taking someone's life. I had trained with my gun, practiced drawing and shooting, but in that moment, I felt completely unprepared. It's one thing to hit paper targets at the range, but it's something else entirely when you're facing a real person. I still don't know if I would have pulled that trigger. Maybe I would have if they'd tried to grab me or if they'd had a weapon. But in that moment, I wasn't sure I could. I think I would have begged them to stop, pleaded with them to leave. It wasn't the badass moment I thought I'd have. Since that night, I've thought a lot about the encounter. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping alone again in quite the same way. The forest can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerous. And now, every time I go out there, I can't help but wonder if there's someone else hiding just beyond the trees, waiting to test my resolve again.